Hey. Well, we have the collective experience of 175 years here on the platform. And if that ain't worth something, I don't know what it I know, it's an absolute delight to be here with Rabbi Ted. We visited with one another yesterday, and
unfortunately, we said everything we had to say.
That's right. And this is not a duel of the Titans, because I agree with everything he said. Just about. We do have a dualism-monism issue, but that sounds a trifle academic to trouble people with this morning. But also, somebody may wish to raise it. This is your morning when we hope to get questions from you. And we have somebody ready here with a mic. But I wanted to just set a premise, if I may, because I think it is important in terms of what I think and what we in Unity think, and of course what Rabbi Ted, I understand, feels. I have always felt that Jesus belongs firmly in the Judaic tradition. To me, Jesus is a Jew. I was heavily influenced by a man in Oxford called Gezer Vermeesh, whose seminars I attended, who wrote a book called Jesus the Jew. He was
the interesting thing about that book is that when it came out, I ordered it. It was delivered by FedEx, and the address to which it was delivered was Jesus the Jew at my address.
The second coming in Seattle, and nobody noticed. Poor Jesus would be deeply shocked were he to return if he saw what the religion reared in his name had achieved in two millennia. No, I don't mean to disparage traditional Christianity. Far from it. Much has been achieved under that rubric, but I do see Jesus as a Jew. I see him as trying to humanize the law of which he was so proud and to which he belonged, the tradition to which he belonged. The gleaning on Sunday, for example. He says, okay, sometimes human needs trump legalistic demands, do they not? Anyway, we won't, if there are attorneys here, they may disagree. We don't need to get into that. But, and I'm not an antinomian by any means. Look that one up. Would you like to carry on from where we are?
No, the strange thing about this is that Jesus would not even recognize that name.
No.
Because the J sound was not in his language.
Yeshua.
His name was a variation of Yehoshua, a variation of Joshua. He would not recognize Christ. I'm not speaking necessarily of the metaphysical truth of
Christ. But the Greek Christus, the anointed one.
The word. So that I don't know what he'd think if he came back. I know one thing for sure. Those who want him back the most would be the most disappointed.
Well, he'd have a beard for one thing.
And by now it'd be white.
Possibly so. Anyway.
Jesus was what's happening now, we think, is that Christians are more able than ever before to accept the Jewishness of Jesus. And correspondingly, it's time for the Jewish community to open themselves to the spiritual teachings of the one who is undoubtedly the most well-known Jewish spiritual teacher in history. So there is a linkage that needs to be honored.
Well, we call ourselves a Judeo-Christian tradition, but we always manage to leave out the Judeo part somehow. And then we've got this 2,000 years of accumulated tradition that we turn to as Christianity. But how much of that reflects the extraordinary spiritual insight that Jesus had. The more I understand the life of Jesus, as we can recreate it, which is not easy, the more extraordinary it becomes. Was he merely a wandering exorcist, or did he perceive realities having to do with eternal life that have eluded us in those 2,000 years? Was he truly resurrected into newness of life? He not only answers questions, but he also poses them for us. And this is what I find so stimulating and so remarkable. There are other great figures in history. Of course there are. Other great religious teachers. But Jesus stands out as a man of eminent common sense. A man who accepts women into his understanding of spiritual values, which was a rare thing in the Judea of his time. It is today, for God's sake. I wonder sometimes, what we've been doing in 2,000 years. He speaks to the Samaritan woman at the well. He has what amounts to a theological discussion with her. It's because those anecdotes are contained in the Gospels that I sometimes believe the Gospels do record the truth of Jesus' utterance, because not in those times would such an event have occurred. There were almost certainly women who followed Jesus as his under discipline, as his disciples. It's an extraordinary breakthrough that he makes in consciousness. He is in so many ways a modern.
I think, if anything, women followed him more faithfully than the men.
Probably so, which is likely, I would think. So, that's something to bear in mind. Well, questions, folks. This is your time. Let's have some questions. Who's got a question? Don't be shy. There's one. Okay. Oh, we got another one here.
I was just curious, the Arab people must have known about Jesus Christ back in his time, and I was just curious how their religion evolved in such a violent, vengeful, awful thing that they've gotten, or that they're doing now.
The Arab. You're talking about the birth of
The fight
Islam.
between the Muslims, the Shia and the Sunnis.
Yeah. Well, that's the kind of internal struggle that you saw between we fought that out in Christianity. I mean, we had Protestants versus Catholics in the 16th century. Long before that, heretics were burned at the stake. I don't think in the contest concerning human violence, Islam is much different from what Christianity has been in the past. There's an awful lot of violence in Christian history, and a lot of it centers around what we would call internecine strife. Struggle against those who don't believe what we're teaching. Struggles against those who question the power structure. And so even though what is happening in Islam seems to our eyes contemporary, it's no different in many ways from what Christianity has endured in the past.
Islam arose essentially in the 6th century. So it's hardly mentioned at all in the New Testament. That was a joke. That's like Christianity is not mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. It's just, by and large, Islam actually is a peaceful faith. Islam actually is a form of the word salam, which is cognate of shalom, a word that means peace and wholeness.
Jerusalem.
Yerushalayim, inheritance of peace. The violence that we see in Islam is far more political than it is religious, and it is often politics masquerading as religion. The majority, like the Arab Muslim population, is only 15% of the world Muslim population. The great center of Islam is in Indonesia. There are about 1.7 billion Muslims. If Islam was as violent as many people believe, the world would look very different than it looks. You know, the countries where there are the most Muslims are among the most peaceful. The Arab countries have political issues, and they have strife among themselves. My colleague Jamal Rahman always says that if the oil revenues in the Arab countries were shared between the Sunni and the Shia, there would suddenly be no more strife between them. So we have to be careful about characterizing others' faiths, you know, and really look carefully. What we've discovered is that it is crucial to meet on a personal level, in this case, Muslims in our community. And since we are the majority, it's up to us to meet the minority, not up to the minority to meet us. The figures keep indicating that those who are most against Islam or most against the increase of mosques are those who never met even one Muslim.
That's right. And you know, I think it's worth remarking too that in the Quran, Judaism is honored as the source of spiritual inspiration. And Jesus is named as a prophet with honor. And so Islam is not anti-Jewish or anti-Christian per se. I think Ted is absolutely right. The passions that are stirred up today, especially in the Middle East, are largely of political derivation.
Yeah, and it's a problem with all new faiths. It's required of a new faith to engage in some kind of supersessionism. You know, in other words, to criticize that which came before and pronounce themselves the truth. When Judaism arose out of a context of paganism, you know, at the end of the Torah it says, never again will a prophet like Moses appear. Christianity, never again will there be the Son of God. Islam, never again will there be a messenger like Muhammad. Every religion closes the door to the next faiths. And it's time for us to recognize that all those closed doors are artificial and all those closed doors are dangerous. They sponsor a kind of exclusivity which is responsible for much of the violence in our personal lives and in our world.
Yes, I agree with you. And let's remember that in the 15th century, it was militant Christianity that drove Islam from the Iberian Peninsula, what we today call Spain and Portugal. For generations, cultured Islamists, Arabs mainly, had lived in peace with Jews and Christians and built an intellectually viable society to which we still turn for inspiration. It can be done. Religions can live in peace, especially when there is continuity, when Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are all recognized to spring from the same fundamental root. It's a tragedy. But it's one again that has been accentuated by political interventionism. But I agree with you very much on the desire to establish an exclusivity, and that is a function of power, is it not? Much of the history of all religions has centered about the attempt of the priestly caste, for want of a better phrase, to establish its power over other people. Jesus came, I believe, to liberate people, not to establish a caste that would subsequently, eventually, demean and diminish and disparage them.
Yeah, I think it's true of every great spiritual teacher comes to bring a freeing, an elevating of spirit and an inclusivity. And then those who follow start creating institutions. There's that old story, you know, of God comes and speaks to some people, and then the devil comes and says, let me organize that for you. and that becomes religion.
bureaucracy.
And it's a function of any institution. I don't think it can be helped, it can only be recognized. And that is, the institution tends to have needs of its own which wind up eclipsing the spiritual reasons for it coming into being.
And they become self-perpetuating.
Exactly.
That's right. And there's an old saw that every religion was founded, as you rightly say, by some prophet who proclaimed the freedom of consciousness and conscience. And then before long, there were tests of orthodoxy and so forth that were applied, and those who didn't measure up to them, of course, were very properly punished.
In the 4th century, when Constantine was making Christianity political power, there were disagreements about which gospels were to be included in the
canon.
Right. There were disagreements about belief. Was Jesus was Jesus actually God, or was Jesus the Son of God?
Oh.
If Jesus is the Son of God, then God is greater than Jesus. If Jesus is God, yes.
Oh, God.
And it was settled. It was settled very easily. One side killed the other people.
Right, very easily. We had a question from a lady here, and did she? I'm sorry. Can we come back to this good soul here, because I know she had a question. So.
Well, it's actually my husband's question.
May we? Okay. Sorry about that, but I was trying to follow a little bit of fairness here.
This is a question, I guess, about, I don't know if I should read the whole thing. He wrote quite a bit, so maybe you want to hear it.
Is he here?
He's right here beside me, but he's kind of shy.
I see. So can we write our answer?
Yes. Actually, I think he probably would prefer that. He said I should give it to you instead of reading it, but I said I'm going to read it because he spent some time writing it. And he says, if you'll, all places of worship give us information for the head about people and their teachings. And he mentions Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, and Zoroaster. The teachings are wonderful, and I love to hear them. But some of the teachings are difficult to incorporate into our lives since we seem to question their validity. For example, in Matthew, Jesus heals an epileptic child after his disciples fail to do so. He then rebuked the disciples, saying, "Truly I tell you, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you." And then he goes on to mention other miracles and other faiths. But the question is, with a planet mired in pollution, war, poverty, homelessness, racial and religious strife, disease, hate, and destruction, how can we learn to use our untapped abilities so that we might show the world a way out of those destructive influences without producing any negative effects? Can unity bring in teachers of miracles to teach us to be healers and movers on a church-wide scale?
May I just respond to that, because I think you raise an important point. There are often people who say that unity does not become socially involved enough, that we don't go out into the community, that we don't proclaim. This is a platform when we're on it, and it's a stage at other times, but they don't proclaim from the platform our concerns with social issues and so forth. The Fillmores believed very much that the world would be changed through individual consciousness. Now, to some people, that seems like a cop-out, but they said when people change their thinking individually, then the world will change. Now, you can buy into that or not, as you please, but it's one way of answering your question. Unity does not become overly concerned, although it would certainly approve of, I've no doubt, major social activities designed to ease the pain and suffering of others, or diplomatic initiatives even. We believe that the world will be changed when individual thinking, when individual consciousness is changed. That's been our premise. Now, whether it's valid, whether it works, whether there's time, I don't know. But that's how we were founded.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, The question that you're raising is the question of the age. From my point of view, any authentic spirituality always expresses itself through compassionate action in the world. And compassionate action in the world, in turn, is supported by spiritual consciousness. And what we've seen is a split between those who are active spiritually and those who are active physically in the world. So the activists tend to not want to have anything to do with spirituality, and the spiritual people have a tendency to kind of withdraw and not act in the world. And what's obviously required is a melding of both. There's a major movement today that's gaining ground called subtle activism. And subtle activism essentially supports what Nicholas was saying and what Unity says, and that is namely the most powerful force in the universe is consciousness. And the degree to which we can hold the consciousness of peace, individually and as communities, can't help but have effects on the world and have effects on the way we interact with ourselves and with each other. However, we don't know what peace is. We know what war is. There used to be signs that said, visualize peace. And I would wonder, what exactly are we visualizing? Are we visualizing a world without conflict? Because a world without conflict, or even lives without conflict, would be so boring. Not only would nothing happen, but we wouldn't grow. Conflict is our invitation to grow. So what would peace look like? And I think it would look like a recognition that the duality that we experience in our world is a requirement of the material level of living. On the material world, every light casts a shadow. On a spiritual level, there is the light of which Nicholas was referring in his meditation. There is that light which in fact includes the light and the dark on this level, and doesn't push out either, but allows them both to be in a way that can preclude violence. Peace is, as far as I can tell, being able to enter into conflictual environments and moments without resorting to violence. Peace is being able to have disagreements with people without dehumanizing them or demonizing them, recognizing that each and every being is essentially equal, that we're all walking vehicles for the same presence, for the same spirit.
Yeah, up to a point I agree.
So we won't go further than that.
Oh yes, we will. I think we still have a huge unresolved issue in our society, in the West at least, between competition and cooperation. You sound like a social Darwinist at times, I think, Ted, because you're saying we can't grow without competition, without competition will lead to conflict.
Yeah, I'm not saying we'll always compete.
No, but I'm saying I think those who've looked at the spiritual approach see that there's a possibility that cooperation may achieve more in the long run than competition. And cooperation may not, in social Darwinist terms, be a satisfactory resolution of our habitual growth as human beings. We may be designed to compete with one another. I have to say, Ted, I'll cooperate with you on this project, or no, I will compete with you. I'll get there to the post first. I'll get the grant. I'll get the write-up in the paper. I'm competing. I'm competitive as hell and I'm sure not going to cooperate with you, but then you feel bad, I feel aggressive. Until we move, I think, into a more cooperative frame, it will be difficult for me to understand how human beings could live more peacefully together. From a philosophical standpoint, as you know as well as I, the philosophers are divided. It was Nietzsche, the German philosopher, who said Christians had the morality of slaves because they always were cooperating with one another and loving one another rather than asserting themselves as the Übermenschen, the overmen, the overpeople should do. So he, I think, clarified in his unique Teutonic way the notion that the future belongs to those who compete rather than those who cooperate. It's up to us to decide. I think those who have pursued some kind of spiritual path will see that if we are all one, and I am a monist in this sense, if we are all one, then surely cooperation is the way forward. As long as we compete, we divide. We become angry, hostile, vengeful, and assertive. And I don't think that's the way to the kind of universal peace that we seek. And I agree with you. Peace is one of those wonderful words that we look at, but we don't really know what it means. To many of us, peace means you shut up and do what I want, my way or the highway.
Yeah, so it seems to me that growing into that world of cooperation would mean that when I enter situations of competition and automatically get reactive, because the ego is always defending itself,
Naturally.
I'm able to recognize that, even share it, but not act it out.
That makes you very vulnerable, of course.
There's no other way.
No,
of course,
right.
We're vulnerable.
You have to open yourself, but you're not afraid to be vulnerable because you feel that you have a spiritual strength, not that enables you to assert yourself, not to claim superiority, but that enables you to freely work with the other person.
Actually, I'm terrified to be vulnerable.
Isn't everybody?
You know, but what I need to accept is that fear.
Yes.
You know, rather than think I can be vulnerable and I'll be fine. Who knows?
Who knows? What is the first and primary human condition? One of self-preservation. I think self-preservation all the time. How am I to preserve myself? It's natural. It's built into us. We forget, whatever we may be spiritually, we also have an animal side to our natures. We used to call it the limbic brain in the 1960s, the crocodile brain. I don't know whether it's there or not. But our first thought often is to preserve ourselves,
well,
self-preservation.
The fight or flight response.
Exactly.
And that's part of us.
And flight is regarded as shameful.
We have this, we are weird beings.
Oh?
You know, we are suffering the post-traumatic stress disorder called embodiment.
Self-reflection.
No, it's embodiment. It's like we come from a spiritual realm where we experience connection, interconnectedness, and then suddenly we awaken in this separate vehicle, incomplete, imperfect, problematic, vulnerable, fragile.
No toolkit.
And we create a personality. We create a persona with which we enter the world, and that becomes our own private institution, which, just like other institutions, we forget it had a function. And we not only convince everybody else that's who we are, we convince ourselves that's who we are. And we forget, wait, we're the ones who created the personality. We're the ones who have that kind of spiritual wisdom and spiritual wakefulness. And it's a matter of getting behind the personality
To the truth.
to recognize who we are.
Isn't this the message in many ways of the allegory of the Garden of Eden? It reminds us that when we achieved self-reflection, and as far as we know, we're the only creatures that have true self-reflection. I love the dolphins and I love the gorillas and all of these things, but do they have real no, we are the creatures that have true self-reflection. And that provides us with a horrifying dilemma, you know, to follow the instincts that are self-preservative, or to act sometimes in a higher way, to reflect on our own behavior. How often do we sit and reflect on our own behavior? This is something I think the spiritual search helps us with. It's what unity helps us with. It's what your thinking helps us with. Let us think about our own motivations. Let us think about our own concepts of what animates and drives us, instead of merely being reactive. And that takes a huge discipline. And that's a dirty word in today's vocabulary, I understand, but there's a discipline involved here. You know, thinking, looking at, analyzing what we're thinking and doing, not just reacting like animals.
No, reactivity is faster than the speed of thought.
It is.
So, and then the ego automatically tries to justify our reactivity. So the challenge is to recognize that we've been reactive.
Precisely.
And to own it. And to say, okay, that I got re-stimulated. Some wound, some pain, some fear got re-stimulated, and I want to revisit that.
Ex post facto.
Yeah, exactly.
Folks, it's getting on here. Do we have a little more time? Should we go on for a minute or two longer? Okay, we have another question.
Yes, I'm from Vancouver, British Columbia, visiting, and I'd just like to say we got Justin Trudeau in, who's probably brighter than anyone running down here. No, my question is, sorry, I shouldn't have thrown that in. This thing that's going on in Iraq and Iran with the nuclear weapons, I do not understand. What are they trying to do? Is it power?
I congratulate you from coming from Vancouver. I had the Unity Church in Vancouver on Oaks Avenue at one time. Were you there?
I was.
Do we remember one another?
I remember you. You're younger.
Next question.
It's power. It's power. Yeah, sure. It's politics. It's power. These things have gone on since the world's beginning. The only thing is the toys we play with now are becoming progressively more and more dangerous. That's the problem. A country like Canada, I think, can play an enormously important role in bringing common sense into international diplomacy. I don't want to talk politics. We don't do that. But I must say that I would be happier to see Canada adopting a neutral stance in many of these issues. Canada has given an example to the world in its willingness to take in immigrants. They won't let me in for some reason, but that's because I'm old and I can't spend $1 million to establish a business. But that's beside the point. I'd love to retire in Vancouver, but I can see it. We live in the islands, and I can actually see Vancouver, and so we wave. But being serious with you just a second, truly, I think this is power. I think it's ignorance. It's based on, as I say, our access to the kind of weapons and means that we never had before, and we should rightly be concerned. But those people of goodwill who can try to bring about peace must do everything they can to step forward, not in the sense that poor Mr. Chamberlain did in 1938 with his umbrella, but in a more assertive role to see what can be done to control and defuse some of these situations. Go ahead, sorry.
If we're expressions of the same presence and the same being, then we have the same needs as each other. So whether it's an individual difficulty or whether it's a national difficulty or whether it's an international difficulty, rather than getting caught in this one's right and one's wrong, one's better and one's worse, it's like, what are you needing? You know, what is a country like Iran needing? What is a country like Iraq needing in this moment? What is their reality? The whole Middle East was decimated at the end of the First World War. Countries that shouldn't have been countries were put together. Dictators were installed and then supported. And our country supported the dictators until all of a sudden we didn't. And then we have been active in totally destabilizing that whole region again. It was, in some ways, far more stable before we started messing around.
I think you're right there, Ted. I would just tell you a story very briefly from history. There was a woman called Gertrude Bell, who was a very brilliant English woman, Oxford graduate. She went out after the First War to what is today Iraq, and she was charged by the Foreign Office, as they then called it, to bring about a settlement because the people who had ruled that area were the Ottoman Empire. They were the Turks, and they had been defeated in the war. And she implored the government not to build a country that didn't take, the British government, didn't take cognizance of the tribal presences. She said, don't make, it's her language, don't make up this kind of a nation because it will dissolve into generations of bloodshed. And of course it did. And Gertrude Bell, alas, in her despair, killed herself in Paris in the late 1920s because she committed suicide, she saw what she had advocated ignored. And these countries formed that had no recognition of the tribal differences, which were and are important to these people. So it's a tragic result of 100 years of alien interference, really, that has brought about so much of this tragedy and has opened the way to the violence that we're seeing in some parts of Islam, tragically. Anyway.
So I know that we have to draw this to a close. Fortunately, we've answered all the questions. I think we need to acknowledge that I'd like to, I've been here actually longer than any minister. So, given that longevity, I'd like to officially welcome Nicholas to this church.
You're so generous.
And just to say how delighted I was to be able to enter into conversation with him yesterday when we met, where we basically rehearsed every word that we shared today. And this is the first time that I've engaged in anything like this. And it was good. So I thank you for the idea and for the conversation.
Well, bless your heart. And I have to say that there are some folk I wouldn't do this with. But I knew yesterday when I met Ted, as I may call him, that we were simpatico. So we've appreciated very much your presence and the fun of this morning and the serious nature behind it. And I thank you again, Ted. And as far as I am concerned, I hope you'll remain the longest standing minister that this church has ever.